Paul Watts, who is visiting professor in sociology here at LSE, coming to talk. So I think hopefully information has been circulated about that. For those online, if you wouldn't mind staying muted during the presentation.
What's he talking about next week?
I can't remember, but
Housing.
Yes, housing, and displacements of social housing tenants. Yes, for those online, if you wouldn't mind staying muted during the presentation, and there should be plenty of time for discussion and Q&A at the end. Also, we are going to record the session, just the main presentation, and then we will stop recording for the Q&A session at the end. So today, we're very happy to welcome Martin Wessel, who is a mixed methods researcher in the Behavioural Insights team, Home Affairs and Social Cohesion team. He manages the Nuffield-funded Revealing Social Capital project, which is a multi-partner programme that leverages large-scale social media data to examine how social networks influence life outcomes. And that's what he's going to be talking to us about today. So I will hand straight over to Martin. Yeah, that should work. No. Yes.
Let me go back. Good.
Or manually go back. Sorry. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thanks, Laura, for the kind introduction, and also to you, Abigail, for inviting me to present our research. It's exciting to do the work, but also even a bit more exciting to present on it. And just maybe very briefly on the Behavioral Insights team, or short BIT. We're a global research consultancy that was initially established within the UK civil service and is now fully owned by the UK innovation charity Nesta. And we basically work with partners in government and the further private sectors to apply behavioral and wider data science methods to solve their challenges. And on this particular project, I'm just one humble individual contributor of a team that was led by researchers affiliated with Meta's Data for Good Lab. And apart from the Beta team and the BIT team, we were also working together with a larger consortium of partners, which includes Stripe Partners, Neighbourly Lab, and the Royal Society of Arts. Just to note, Meta's contributions to this project were self-funded, whereas ours and one of our partners were generously funded by the Nuffield Foundation. So the principal component of the research that I'll talk to you about today is a replication of a study that was done in the US 2 or 3 years back, led by the Harvard professor Raj Chetty, and it was a sort of first of its kind large-scale study of social capital across the US and its association with economic mobility. And what they did there is they analyzed the social media data of, I think, roughly 70 million Facebook users in the US, and mapped aggregate levels of different measures of social networks and connectedness across zip codes and counties in the US, and then looked how these are associated with varying levels of economic mobility. And one of the key findings of the study was that the density of friendships between people from above median socioeconomic backgrounds and below median socioeconomic backgrounds was one of the strongest area-level predictors of economic mobility in the US. And in other words, the more friendships that were observed in neighborhoods between these two different groups, the higher the adult earnings of disadvantaged children that grew up in these neighborhoods. And what we're doing is basically trying to replicate this in the UK with a similar data set, but we also want to build on these quantitative analyses by conducting ethnographic research in certain outlier neighborhoods with either low or high levels of social capital, to better understand what the local drivers of these different levels of social capital are, and also work with members of these communities as well as a broader set of policymakers to design and develop prototype, potentially, interventions to strengthen the types of social capital that matter for equalizing inequalities. We have recently published the sort of initial results of the quantitative replication of the US work, and what I will be speaking about today are mostly the results of the study. The qualitative study is fieldwork is completed, and we're just writing up the the findings of that, and we'll possibly publish it over the summer. So stay tuned for that. All of this is freely available on BIT's website, and also most of the data that I'll talk about today is also freely available for you to explore online. So what did we do? As I said, the main aim was to understand the association of social capital and economic mobility in the UK. We did use 3 different sources of data for that. The main data set obviously being this kind of unique area level social capital data set that we constructed at the local authority district and postcode district level using the data of about 20.5 million Facebook users, aged 25 to 64. That covers roughly 58% of the UK population that age. And the users included in our analytical sample are all active on Facebook and not deemed to be fake accounts, just for external validity purposes. We also estimated economic mobility at the same 2 geographical levels. For that, we used the longitudinal educational outcomes data set and followed a methodology that is, to my belief, widely used in UK social mobility research, but more on that later. And then lastly, we also ran a small survey with a subset of 3,700 Facebook users in the UK that were part of our wider analytical sample, basically to understand the individual level relationship between our social network metrics and measures of subjective well-being and trust. It's a lot of data, and I figured before I talk you through the results, I might spend a bit of time explaining all of these, and in particular the social capital metrics. They are unique in their scale, but also to some extent in what they measure, and they're part informed. So we calculate 7 different social capital metrics across 3 different categories, and then part informed by previous literature in the social capital field. See some tensions down at the slide. But also by just what's feasible to do with the sort of social network data that the meta team can collect on Facebook. And starting us off, the first category are 3 measures of connectedness between people from different groups. And the main one here, not only in this category, but maybe our study more generally, is economic connectedness, which is what I previously alluded to already, the share of friends of below median socioeconomic status that people who are above median socioeconomic status have. And while friendship networks are very easily to track on Facebook, socioeconomic status is not. There's a few people who publicly post their wealth or affluence on their profiles. So the way we estimate this is using a survey-based machine learning model, which takes into account things like the phone that people use when they log into Facebook, area level, like based on their postcode, area level characteristics of affluence, also like the activity on things like Facebook Marketplace, like what sort of things they buy and sell, and some other things. I'm not going to go into much detail on that. Happy to answer questions later, but there's also lots of data in our working paper on our website. The other cross-type connectedness measure we collect is language connectedness, and this is just the share of the friends of people with a non-English primary language who have English as their primary language. And by primary language here, we mean the language in which they set their Facebook app or website to. And lastly, in this category, we also collect age connectedness, and this is the share of friends of people aged 25 to 34 who are aged 35 to 44. That's the cross-type connectedness measures. Moving on to network cohesiveness. Here we collect 2 variables or aggregate 2 variables. The first one, clustering, is pretty easy to conceptualize and understand. It's the average share of friends or all the friends with each other in a given postcode district or local authority district. And then the second one, in my experience when explaining this research, is always like a little bit more difficult to grasp, but it's the bridge ratio, which is the average share of friend pairs in a certain area that have no other friend in common. So kind of like bridge out of the usual social circles of a person. Sometimes in the literature, this is also conceptualized in a sort of opposite way, like kind of like a support ratio, where instead of looking at the share of friendships that are unsupported, we kind of calculate the share of friendships that have at least one mutual friend in common. It took me a while to understand this, so maybe I'll illustrate this quickly with a brief example. So if we look at this social network on the left side, we have Bob, Tom, Alice, and Liz at the center of it. And Liz's friendships to Tom and Bob are supported by Bob and Tom's mutual friendship. So these three sort of form like one close social circle. But then the friendship that Liz has to Alice, you can see there's like no other line that is shared to any third person. So this is a sort of like bridging connection. And, you know, for Liz's network, she has 1 out of 3 bridging friends. So her bridge ratio is about 33%. Just to note on that, 33% is not a very realistic bridge ratio. So in our data set, we don't really observe any context in which it is that high. The bridge ratio for a certain neighborhood would usually range between 2 and maybe maximum 8%, which I think anecdotally makes sort of sense if you think about the friends or connections you have that you have no other person in common with. I'd be very surprised if it's more than just a handful. Anyway, last category of social capital measures are 2 measures of civic engagement. Here we measure participation in civil society organizations. This is measured by the group membership of Facebook users in a particular area. Volunteering groups are any sort of group that in their Facebook description says that, you know, they're like in some way involved in like community service, like more structured volunteering activities such as Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. Whereas activism groups are the ones that in their description indicate that they are subscribed to some sort of social, political, or environmental cause. Yeah, and then very briefly on economic mobility. So I said already, we used a LEO data set, which is an administrative data set, owned by the DfE and some other government departments, which basically, I think, links English pupils' educational records to their employment and earnings data in adult life. The methodology we used to use this data set to estimate economic mobility at the different area levels follows very closely from what people at the IFS have done before. And basically, we define in areas economic mobility as the average adult income rank at age 28 for children that grew up in this area at age 16 and at that point in time were eligible for free school meals. And we do that for the birth cohorts ranging from 1986 to 1992, which covers about 2 million men and 1.9 million women. These are not all FSM eligible children, but the whole data set. And then we can use that data to estimate economic mobility for all 309 local authority districts in England and roughly 1,600 postcode districts. The economic mobility coverage for the postcode districts is a bit patchier. There's postcode districts that are like relatively granular geographically. I live in N16RD, so my postcode district is just N1. And for many postcode districts in the UK, especially in more affluent areas, there's just not enough FSM eligible children that grew up in our birth cohorts to meet the owners' public thresholds. That's economic mobility. And the last data set that we used, the survey I mentioned earlier, here basically we just, it's an opt-in survey that was advertised on the Facebook newsfeed to users in the UK, and then 3,700 completed it and answered questions like life satisfaction, trust, and feelings of connection and support. And I can get into detail on the questions later. Life satisfaction, I guess the ONS4, I think as they're known here. And a second purpose of the survey was also to validate our measures of group engagement. So there was reasonable reasons for us to believe that the groups that people are part of on Facebook don't like fully cover the civic engagement or activities and hobbies that they engage in their day-to-day. So we kind of asked this subsample of our whole analytic sample on their actual self-reported group engagement and then cross-validated our observed Facebook measures. Yeah, lots of data. But now we can, get into what we actually found. And I think it's nice to start with some just general observable characteristics of social networks across the UK. And one of our kind of main findings, and what got picked up a lot by the media reporting around this publication, is the sort of fact that across the country, perhaps surprisingly to some, friendships in the UK aren't as stratified by income as some might have expected. So what we find is that people in the bottom half of our SES measure still have 47% of their friendships in the top half. And if you compare this, what Raj Chetty et al. Found in the US, which was just 39%, there's quite a substantial difference here. Also, that's kind of nicely illustrated by the graph on the right-hand side of the slide. We do find that even at the sort of like really bottom end and top ends of the socio-economic distribution, people still mingle and connect with each other, not to a great extent, and definitely less than they would if they formed friendships at random. But some might have thought that there's no connection between these two ends of the socioeconomic spectrum at all. However, and this might also not be super surprising, the density of cross-economic ties across the UK is not very equally distributed. So we have here 3 UK maps of 3 of the social capital measures we estimated at the postcode district level. And if we look at the first map, economic connectedness, darker shades indicate more economically connected areas, darker blue ones, darker red ones, less so. And what we observe is that in the traditionally more affluent south of England, we see economic connectedness ratios of up to 60%. So 60% of north of 60% of the friends of low income people are high income, whereas economically more deprived areas such as Northern Ireland or the Scottish Central Belt show much lower rates of economic connectedness. And as I said, there's like something very intuitive to it. You can imagine that in an area where there's more people with higher incomes or more affluence in general, it's easier for the fewer portion of the population that lives on low incomes to make friends with them. But we do see it in our data too. It feels intuitively right. Moving on to the middle map, which is the clustering ratio, so the share of friends that are friends with each other. Here we see that the clustering ratios tend to be really high in rural areas of the UK and less so in more urban areas, which again feels pretty in line with priors of many. There's also an interesting relationship where it's not a perfect inverse relationship, but we do see that a lot of the areas that are high in EC on the very left map do exhibit like lower levels of clustering. And then lastly, volunteering. Again, we see big differences across the country. There's no clear pattern to spot here. You can look up those maps interactively online and then find out how your own neighborhood performs on these metrics. But volunteering differs pretty largely. If we zoom in on London, we can see that a lot of the patterns that are true for the wider UK also apply to London. So economic connectedness is highest in the wealthier boroughs of the southwest of the city, where it gets lower at the sort of in the boroughs that are east of the center. Again, this kind of inverts a little bit with clustering around London. And then what we see on volunteering, I think, is that most of London shows volunteering rates that are very well below the country's average that we saw on the maps before, apart maybe from little pocket at the very eastern border of the city, which does display a pretty high rate of volunteering. That's what EC looks like across the country. And now, if we compare these social capital variables with our area level variations of economic mobility, this is a multivariate regression of economic mobility on all of our social capital variables at the local authority district, only for England, because we only have economic mobility data for England. And what we see is that after controlling for all of them, economic connectedness and the bridge ratio I explained before have the strongest positive association with economic mobility. There's only so much that you can derive from the regression coefficient, and I kind of prefer to look at this data for maps, so more maps. This time just for England and not at the postcode district, but the local authority district level. The color coding works similar to the maps you saw before. Left, we have economic connectedness. On the right, we have the average adult income rank for FSM children. And what we see is that there's like pretty decent overlap between the two. This is again probably not so surprising because taking into account the strong relationship that EC has with general area affluence, and assuming that children disadvantaged children growing up in more affluent areas have more opportunities to advance in life. This is kind of what we'd expect to see. We kind of estimate that in our economic mobility data set, disadvantaged children that grow up in the top 10% most connected areas end up earning about 38% more annually, which translates into, I think, an average of £5,000. But yeah, this obviously is heavily confounded by just general area affluence. And I don't have to graph in these slides, but in our working paper, we do also control for, or like run a regression similar to the one before, but control for median weekly incomes in an area or GCSE achievement. And while EC doesn't come out as the strongest predictor of social mobility, it is still a significant one, which may suggest that there's an effect that EC might have over and above just its correlation with general area affluence. It's very important to note with all the analyses that I'm showing you today, like none of this is causal. So far, this is just correlational, and I'm going to withhold any claims of what might be impacting what and through which channels. But it is still an interesting relationship to observe. A nice contrast gives the other social capital measure that was, strongly positively associated with the economic mobility in the regression graph I showed you before. So this is the map on the right side is the same as on the slide before, but now on the left side, we map out the bridge ratio across local authorities. And we see again, there's like relatively decent overlap between the two. And again, the bridge ratio does tend to be higher in more affluent areas in the south, as is economic mobility. But there's something interesting and different about the relationship of these two variables compared to the previous two. So you recall the map of London I showed you before, the maps. You will have seen that EC is pretty low in the east of the city. Whereas economic mobility, and many researchers found this before, is actually pretty high in eastern boroughs of London. And if you look at it's a bit small here, but if you look at the bridge ratio within London, you can see that it's actually quite high in East London. And it's also relatively high in other economically deprived areas in the UK, which still have high rates of economic mobility. And we kind of plot this. There's a lot happening here, so I might walk you through this chart one by one. But basically, each dot here represents a postcode district for which we have sufficient economic mobility data. And on the y-axis, these are plotted by their average bridge ratio. We measure using Facebook data. And on the x-axis, we plot them by the rate of income deprivation taken from the income component of the 2019 index of multiple deprivation. And then all of these dots are colored by the quintile of economic mobility that they're in. So the quintile of average adult income rank for FSM children that grew up in each postcode district. And what's really interesting about this graph is if we take a sort of like horizontal slice and look only, if we're kind of holding like in bridge ratio constant and look only at the postcode districts with very high bridge ratios across all levels of income deprivation, we can see that even like at the lower ends of the income deprivation distribution, they do tend to be brighter and greener than the rest. There's some outliers, but in general, like neighborhoods with a high bridge ratio, independent of their economic deprivation level, do seem to exhibit like high levels of economic mobility. And if we then take a vertical slice, so this time we're holding income deprivation constant and only look at the neighborhoods that sort of sit between a 14 and 19% rate of income deprivation, and then sort of slowly move up from like the bottom postcode districts in terms of bridge ratio up to like the higher ones. We see that the colors get like pretty consistently greener, the colors of the dots, which means like holding income deprivation constant, the higher the bridge ratio of a neighborhood, the better economic mobility for children that grew up there. The relationship isn't perfect, and you can see that like in the bottom left corner, if we go back to the full graph, there's certainly like a lot of very green dots that have low levels of income deprivation, but also low levels of bridge ratios and still decent or like very good economic mobility statistics. But what this may suggest, and this is a finding we're like still exploring a bit more, so looking into who these bridge ratio connections are, that it might be a mediator for which bridge ratio sort of like affects economic mobility and is sort of like impacted by concentrated poverty and here measured by income deprivation. That's all on economic mobility and social capital. I'll briefly speak about the survey that we ran, which also had like some interesting results. In general, there's a strong relationship between most measures of good social networks and social capital and the different variables of subjective well-being that we collect. So if you look at some of these regression coefficients, you can see that it's not just the share of high SES or very high SES friends, but also the share of close friends and just small friends in general that is very highly correlated with how you feel about your life and how connected and supported you feel. This is, again, probably not very surprising. All these graphs here are controlling for participants' age, income, and gender. But then again, this is not causal at all. It's just like a simple correlation of these two variables with each other. An interesting tidbit of these graphs is the trust one. So in contrast to all the others, what you see with trust is that just having more friends in general doesn't seem to be like highly associated with greater trust in your neighbors, people in general, or people in the UK. But having rich friends, I guess, does seem to be like relatively positively associated with trust. And it's like slightly out of what you would expect otherwise. And then the third thing about these graphs that is interesting, if we go back to the bridge ratio, we obviously, on the graphs before I showed you that the bridge ratio might be a way in which traditionally deprived areas can still people growing up, they can still experience great economic mobility. But what we see here when we correlate individuals' bridge ratios with well-being is that almost on all of the measures that we collect, it is negatively correlated with life satisfaction, feeling of disconnection and social support, which, this is again all correlational, but it might suggest that there could be a sort of trade-off between, advancing in life or taking up opportunities and individual well-being, about going out and beyond of your social circles and meet friends that you wouldn't usually. Then lastly, before I open it up for questions, we do only for economic connectedness so far, but we did take like a deeper look into, okay, where are these friendships formed and what drives differences in these friendships across areas, but also other settings such as schools, universities, or different groups that people are part from. And this graph is just showing so we can only assign about a third of the friendships that we analyze to a particular context in which they were formed, or like a narrow context at least. But what we see here, and this is total friendships, not just friendships across income boundaries, that most of the friendships that both low and high income people form are formed in the neighborhoods, in the immediate neighborhoods, or in secondary school. For both of these, the difference between low and high income people also isn't very stark. I guess there's low income people do tend to form more of their friendships in their local area than high income people do. But then when you look at hobby groups and faith-based groups, both of them are like pretty low. The universities are also an interesting one. So here, and this is again, probably not unsurprising given the differences in access to higher education, but high income people do tend to form a bigger share of their friendships in university than people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds do. And then, looking at the two factors that explain the difference in cross-economic connections that are formed in all these settings, it's also like very much inspired by the way it was done in the US study, but we do sort of split out economic connectedness into two determinants, and the first of which is exposure. And exposure kind of aims to measure a settings, that can be a neighborhood or a school, university, segregation by income. And the way it's calculated is just by looking at the share of high SES individuals that are present in a particular setting. There's two extreme illustrative examples on the left-hand side of this slide. So we have School A, in which is attended by 4 high SES students, which makes the exposure kind of 1. So, everybody is a high SES student at that school. And then in school B, which is exclusively attended with low SES students, this rate falls to 0. They are very stylized. There's no school that looks like that. But I think it illustrates quite nicely how we calculate exposure. And then the second component, which we call friending bias, is a measure of how many cross-economic friendships in a particular context are formed conditional on exposure, sort of holding exposure constant. And it's calculated by 1 minus the share of high SES friends of low SES people in this context, divided by the exposure of that context. It's very complicated to speak about equations without showing them, but I think school C and D, again, very extreme examples, illustrate quite nicely what we mean by friending bias. So school C is on exposure, like on segregation, pretty well balanced. So we have 2 low SES students and 4 high SES students, an exposure of 50%. But then we can see that in the friendships that the low SES students form in the school, which is in this case only 1, is exclusively to another low SES student. So that the sort of like, the rate of friendship is 0. Although they did have the opportunity to mingle with 2 other friends, which they didn't have in school B. And then the friending bias equals 1. And then school D is a sort of like very positive example of where everybody is just friends with everyone and everybody mingles. And it's when the friending bias falls to 0. Other than with exposure, friending bias can be lower than 0. So you can imagine a school in which low SES students do actually form more friendships with high SES students than the exposure would predict. Those cases exist in our data, but they are relatively rare, and friending bias is mostly a little bit higher than 0, indicating that conditional exposure, people form less cross-economic friendships than random chance in a particular setting would predict. And then, basically we use these exposure and bias variables to look at how they differ across the different settings. And on the left side, you can see a graph of the average exposure across all the postcode districts, secondary schools, universities, and so on that we have sufficient data for. And what we can see is that in particular universities do have the highest rates of exposure. That means the highest rates of high SES individuals within a particular university. Again, not very surprising, and that's something you would expect. At the same time, places like hobby groups or faith-based groups are like a little bit lower. And what that suggests to us is that high and low SES individuals more often attend different types of hobby groups rather than being the same ones together. Hobby groups here is a bit of a catch-all category for now, and it includes sports, which are 5-a-sides, cricket, rugby, and whatever is common in the UK, but also like arts and crafts, theatre, and other like special interest groups. We're currently working on splitting it out a bit more to see like whether there are like differences in exposure on like whether there are like certain hobby groups that are attended well by both types of groups. But that's still a work in progress. And then looking at the bias. So this is again like conditional exposure, how many cross-economic friendships are formed in a particular setting. Universities again do quite well here and are closely followed by hobby groups and faith-based groups and workplaces. So what that means is that low SES people in these contexts are more likely to befriend a high SES person that's present there too than they would be in postcode districts or sixth form colleges, which exhibit pretty high rates of friending bias. And what this may be suggesting to a policymaker is that, for one, expanding university access to low SES students could foster more cross-economic friendships, or for hobby groups, more encouraging more mixed use of sports facilities or other ways of increasing exposure in hobby groups and making sure people from different socioeconomic backgrounds do spend time together doing the same hobbies. Or encouraging workplace socializing, given the workplace also exhibits pretty low average bias. And thinking through these in more detail is kind of what we are doing next. We're also currently working on a causal identification strategy to estimate the causal effects that our variables of social capital might have on economic mobility. And we're also analyzing how these area level variables of social capital relate to other outcomes such as crime, health, and education. The core research, I mentioned it already, is being published very soon. And on the back of that, we're also currently in organizing and planning participatory workshops with members of these communities to analyze, digest these results and get ideas from them of what might help strengthen social capital in their neighborhoods. And we are conducting expert roundtables with policymakers and people who work in civil society organizations to basically develop and prototype a few ideas of what might work to strengthen social capital in the UK. That's all from me. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Martin. So we've got a good 20 minutes now for discussion and Q&A. For those online, if you want to unmute, raise your hand, and then you can unmute and ask your question yourself, or pop it in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable with. I think we'll maybe start in the room, just give people online a chance to process that. So, Ellie, is anyone else in the room? We'll take a few at a time, if that's okay. Ellie, again.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I was wondering how you accounted for differences in how people use Facebook. So, like, I use Facebook, for example, just anecdotally